So my name is Katie Tyndall. I am a grad student at Cornell in the City and Regional Planning program. I am the research assistant for Professor Linda Shai, who is the chair of the Climate Action Task Force, which is a task force of the Association for Collegiate Schools of Planning. So this spring, we organized a great career panel series on individuals that work in kind of the climate change adaptation space. And that includes kind of like a broad overview. So our last panel earlier last month was on housing and climate change. This one is on decarbonization and transportation. And some of these individuals are working in the intersection of those issues. Some people are working just decarbonization or just transportation, but some really diverse voices here speaking today. And I will allow the panelists to begin to introduce themselves, and then Professor Manville, if you wouldn't mind doing that as well. And then you guys can jump into the questions. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And I'll still be here just with my video. So Sarah, if you'd like to go first.
Yeah, can you guys hear me okay? Okay, great. Hi, everyone. It's so exciting to be back in virtual Cornell CRP world. I'm Sarah Doherty, use she, her pronouns. I graduated CRP class of 2016, which is crazy. Like, can't believe that I started 10 years ago. I still feel like I just got out of school. I work at Invenergy for our offshore wind project, which I can talk about. I don't want to go into too much detail now, but it's called Leading Light Wind. I'm sort of new to the climate mitigation space. I had been working more in the design adaptation space. I worked for a while at Waterfront Alliance, building a rating system like LEED for resilient waterfront development. But yeah, it's been a really exciting switch, and excited to share more. Thanks for having me.
I can jump in. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tamika Butler. I am a third-year PhD student at UCLA in their urban planning department, focusing on transportation and specifically mobility justice related work. Before that, I had many careers. I was an employment law lawyer and also a private consultant in the transportation field. So I worked at Tool Design as the director of California Planning and the director of Equity and Inclusion. And I also started my own consulting firm where I've kind of had a smattering of clients at the intersection of transportation and climate, everything from private foundations like the Energy Foundation or Bar Foundation to city or county agencies. So I helped LA write their first sustainability plan, the county of LA, and have just done a ton of stuff about how transportation and climate intersect, and very excited to be here.
I think I'm next. So I'm Andrew Salzberg. I'm currently a program officer at a foundation called Climate Imperative. So we're one of the largest climate philanthropies in the world, and I manage a transportation portfolio there. But I'm new to philanthropy. That's less than a year that I've been there. My career, since I was finished planning, was all transportation and all in my own head focused on climate, certainly wherever I was. Some of the organizations I worked at were very focused on climate action, some less so, but we can talk all about that. I've been at the World Bank and Uber and a few other places in between.
Great, thanks to the three of you. I'm the moderator. My name's Mike Manville. I'm a professor at UCLA, so I currently work where Tamika is, and I was once a professor at Cornell, and so Sarah and I overlapped there, and I'm afraid Andrew and I have just never pedagogically crossed paths, so nothing's perfect. So I'm your moderator. I won't, I think the best thing to do is jump into this list of questions that Katie has sort of thoughtfully come up with. And they basically, I think the goal of this panel is to help folks who are listening get a sense both of what the three of you do related to decarbonization and transportation, and also how you got into, what was the path from, and some of you have sort of hinted at that a bit in your introductions, which is very helpful. But so I think the first thing the first question I'll pose is maybe kind of a hybrid of a couple of the questions Katie thoughtfully prepared for us. And so one is just sort of like, specifically, how did you find your way into the world of decarbonization and transportation planning? And then just a little bit about where you are right now, what aspects of that are you working on? And I guess, for no other reason than to pick something up, we'll go in sort of reverse order that we did before. So we'll start with Andrew, roll back through Tamika, and then Sarah. So have at it, Andrew, if you would.
Yeah, so I've been, I actually now teach a class. I went to Harvard for planning. I think I should answer that question. So I feel like maybe there's a hockey rivalry between Cornell. I'm Canadian, so I care about hockey more than the average person. But I did that longer ago than Sarah, at least. I graduated 2007, so it doesn't feel like that recently that I graduated from planning school. But I was writing papers in undergrad in 2006 about urban form and climate change. So I think I've been on the beat for a while. My dad's an architecture professor, and he's Dutch, and I grew up without a car. And I didn't get my driver's license till I was 30. So I was sort of, a classic, mobility motivated planning student, I think, at some point. And so came at it definitely as someone who thought city design was in a weird place in North America. And I went to Harvard to do planning, definitely had climate on my mind, as I mentioned. It was a bit of a different place in 2006 and 7 than it is now. But certainly there was sort of a wave of talking about it. Al Gore's movie had come out at that time. So there was a lot of like climate energy in a sort of earlier incarnation of its life. But I studied planning. I went to work at the World Bank for many years after that. I was a transit person. That was kind of my focus, public transportation. Did some investment projects in China and the World Bank for a while. And then I found my way at Uber, which was a very big shift in 2013. It was a startup company, small place. I stayed there for many years. I helped to create a sustainability team there on the premise that Uber might be able to buy more electric vehicles more quickly than other places and kind of accelerate that trend. That wasn't that true when I was there, but there's some reporting now that it has turned true. So if we get into more on the kind of tech company space, that's certainly someplace that I was maybe pushing internally in a direction that was different than some of the leadership to sort of get things done, which can be a very rewarding place to be. If you're one person selling something that other people are not focused on, that can be great. I'm in a different situation now. I now actually teach a class at MIT called, not creatively, Decarbonizing Urban Mobility, which hopefully will be an online course at some point if folks are interested. And I work at a philanthropy. And so the nice thing about philanthropy, there's no return on investment. We're giving away money. And the particular philanthropy that I work at is very, very focused on policy outcomes, binding policy outcomes that reduce emissions, which are really, my belief is that that's the main thing we have to do, is really get government policy in place to sort of push decarbonization to happen. And part of why I think that is during my time at Uber, there was lots of arguments about why we might care about sustainability, from investor pressure to public goodwill. But the thing that really moved the needle typically was the city of London required us to buy electric vehicles, or the state of California had a binding mandate to do that kind of work. And it felt to me from inside of a large, well-resourced corporation that the real things that was driving action were meaningful government policy to make that kind of thing happen. So that's part of what led me to where I am now, which is that we fund advocacy, research, and basically pressure of all kinds to get the most impactful emissions reduction policy done globally. And not just in transportation. I manage a little transportation in the US program, but we have work on industrial decarbonization and building decarbonization and electric sector work. So I'm kind of, what I wanted to do was be the transportation person in a climate-focused organization rather than the climate-focused person in a transportation company organization. They're kind of different ways to play the same game a little bit. But for me, it's been great to be alongside people who are thinking about thermal batteries and clean steel and clean concrete and things that I really know absolutely nothing about. And that's where I've been only for the last little less than a year, but a lot of my journey through nonprofit, international World Bank life and sort of high profile, in the news a lot, tech company life has led me to the belief that really public policy is important. And one of the ways we get good policy is advocacy and research that really only philanthropy is positioned to fund. So that's my time. And yeah, our specific organization really is narrowly focused on big public policy with big emissions reductions, and we have a part of it that's transportation.
Great. So
Great.
I come to transportation from law. As I said, I was a civil rights lawyer in San Francisco. And my job was to help people with whatever employment discrimination issues they had, with a specific emphasis on Black folks in San Francisco, where the Black population has been decreasing year over year. And so as I started that work, it became very clear to me that transportation was a big part of what people were dealing with. I got fewer questions about, this thing happened to me at work and I felt discriminated against, and much more people wanted to talk to me about the Muni line that was going to be through Bayview Hunters Point, and my politics on it, and as their way of kind of assessing who I was. And so I think that was really the first time that I opened my eyes to transportation. Had a lot of different jobs in between being a lawyer and ending up in urban planning. I was working at a nonprofit doing economic development work. I was working at a private foundation here in LA, leading their Boys and Men of Color and LGBTQ work. And then I ended up seeing that the Bike Coalition in LA was hiring. I applied to be the executive director there, ended up getting that job, and kind of just falling in love with urban planning, feeling like the veil had been lifted, and having no idea that urban planning, and I think to Andrew's point, that so many policy decisions were tied to this work. Because I come to transportation from a bicycling background, I think decarbonization and kind of the environmental aspects of transportation have always been a part of my story. As I kind of ventured into the consulting world, Tool Design is a transportation consulting firm that is focused explicitly on active transportation. And so again, climate was always part of the ethos at that firm. Jennifer Toole, who started the firm, is a landscape architect, and the firm has planners, landscape architects, and engineers. And her view was always, you need all of these different perspectives on a project to make the most impactful project. And one of those ways that she always thought about how can a project be impactful is what's the impact on the environment? How does it help? How does it reduce the imprint we're leaving on the world? And that was a big part of everything we did, not just from projects, but are we going to fly to this conference? Because what's the impact that has on the planet? And so I think I was really lucky to be taught by someone who really instilled that in me. Tool Design has 17 offices across the country and in Canada. And so as the California Planning Director, and as someone who is part of my Director of Equity and Inclusion role, I was actually going to Canada quite a bit. My wife's Canadian, and so I took every chance I could to visit family. And I think between some of the government initiatives in Canada, and then being the California Planning Director, again, to Andrew's point, policy matters. And because I was heading planning in the state that said that we were not going to solve our climate problems without thinking about transportation, many of the projects that we were getting to work on in California had this big climate impact. And so I was really lucky when I started my own consulting firm. I was able to stay on a number of contracts I had at Tool. And I, as I said, helped the county of LA think of their sustainability plan. And they really tried to think about how does climate impact all of these other areas of life, from political participation to transportation to building decarbonization. And so my job on that project was really to kind of lead how we were thinking about equity, how we were thinking about the community's involvement. And I think I really started doing more climate work when Energy Foundation reached out to me to give a keynote at one of their sessions. I ended up talking to a few of the program officers, and then I worked with their transportation team, who was thinking about how do we make transportation equitable? How do we think about decarbonization? And how do we not only stay focused on electrification? Electrification might be part of the answer, but it might not be all of the answer. And we think there are people in frontline communities, low-income communities of color, who have some ideas about how to be more climate conscious in their transportation practices. And we're maybe not funding them as this huge funder. And so I got to work with Energy Foundation over 2 years to create a fund where, in the first round, we selected a group of nonprofits who were doing really innovative decarbonization and climate transportation work. And then we worked with them to do grantee-led philanthropy. And so they got to go out and they got to find other entities who were doing work. And we saw a lot of really innovative stuff all the way from Hawaii to the southeast of the United States, just different ways that frontline communities who might not use all the words that we use as experts, but we're doing just some really innovative, awesome stuff around transportation and climate. And so I think that's kind of been my path. And even though I am in the PhD program, I continue to work with the Energy Foundation and other climate funders on a lot of different ways to think. Again, I think the big push right now with a lot of the funders I'm working with is how do we think about decarbonization beyond electric vehicles? We have to invest in electrification, but we're also seeing that that's not going to be the only solution. And so how do we do that work, and how do we do it in a way that doesn't just build upon many historical inequities in transportation and just create larger disparities within the field? So I think I'll stop there and pass it to Sarah.
Yeah, these are such interesting backgrounds, and there are definitely like a few themes that I'm relating to a lot, and I feel like the carrots and
Well,
getting a little bit of feedback. Okay, cool. The carrots and sticks policy versus, we live in a capitalist society, market incentives thing has always been like a really big driving force of my curiosity in urban planning and career. And I would definitely say that policy, for me, Biden and the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law have like basically paved the way for me having a career, and hopefully a whole industry that allows for many other wonderful planners to have careers. So there's that. I guess just the quick origin story. I was an English major undergrad, and I moved to New York City wanting to get a job in publishing and write my novel on the side, which was like really sad because I realized I couldn't get a job in publishing, and who the hell has time to write a novel on the side? So dreams were crushed, and I got a job with the Parks Department as an AmeriCorps, planting street trees. It was part of a public health initiative. Through that, I was like, oh wow, urban planning is a thing. And I've always really cared about climate change. Like, that is probably the through line I've known. I have anxiety as a person, but I also know that like from a young age, I felt very anxious about climate change. And so that experience led me to think about environmental initiatives as people focused, because we were doing a lot of the tree planting and around public housing. And I learned like how problematic the whole policy was, because they were trying, my job was to basically teach people in public housing how to take care of this city infrastructure. And because the Parks Department didn't have the budget to do it themselves. So I knew I wanted to go into urban planning with an equity focus. When I was at Cornell, I feel like I went down like a very niche route, but I was very deep into international planning. I studied the way that the 100 Resilient Cities Rockefeller Foundation initiative, speaking of philanthropy, like how the mission and the purpose played out in practice in informal settlements along rivers in Indonesia. And through that, like got really, basically interested in how these initiatives, have unintended consequences in some cases, which I'd love to talk more about, Andrew, like your thoughts on that. But yeah, from there, I went to work at a think tank in DC, actually with Professor Beard, for those that are at Cornell. and was doing a lot of international development research. And it was such an incredible opportunity. I definitely realized that I missed like the localized scale of work. So I moved back to New York, started working at the Waterfront Alliance, where I feel like I really built my planning resilience career. I was there for 5 years and got to help with the Rockefeller Foundation grant create WEDGE, Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines, which was supposed to be like a rating system for resilient, sustainable, and equitable waterfront development. So again, we were sort of like using WEDGE as a tool to advocate for better policy and resilient zoning that takes into effect sea level rise and all these different climate impacts. But it was sort of like a market-driven incentive tool. I had like a brief stint after that in ESG consulting, which was probably the most stressful job of my life. So I left after 6 very long months, and then also tried to start my own consulting practice. So Respect. Once I realized how complicated the taxes were, I was like, not for me. No, paycheck, healthcare, good. Maybe someday, because I really do love being able to like research and go down the research rabbit holes that I love, and I think that there is demand for that. But I started working at a consulting firm in New York City called CARP Strategies that is women, minority owned, and it was really cool because they were small and doing a lot of mission-based strategies for offshore wind developers to develop these stakeholder engagement plans. So maybe I could talk about this later, but now here, the offshore wind industry, my current boss reached out. I moved over basically from the client to the company, and I'm now the community engagement manager for this offshore wind project, where I'm doing a ton of outreach day to day just to tell communities what offshore wind is, debunk the myths about offshore wind killing whales, and also implement our $150 million community benefits program, which has been really, really cool because there are lots of ways to spend that money. And I think Cornell especially gave me like a really solid foundational understanding of systemic change and how to truly empower, have an empowering community development approach. So yeah, stop there.
Okay, excuse me, that's great. All three of you, thank you so much. I think, you know, one thing that becomes clear listening to our three panelists talk is that there's a pretty wide variety of avenues one can take to go down this path, ranging from, to Andrew's point, working in very large institutions, whether it's what becomes a very big private company like Uber, or just an established NGO like the World Bank, lots of resources, lots of clout, to working for the Bicycle Coalition in Los Angeles, which is probably at the opposite end of influence as the World Bank. And then also, the nonprofit and consulting world, which is, I think, extremely important just part of the planning ecosystem. It's how a lot of ideas travel from city to city and person to person. A lot of city planners per se are so overwhelmed that it's hard for them to really keep abreast of what's happening in other places, and a lot of that information travels through consultants. And then we just see different domains, right? I mean, Sarah, you're working now a lot with wind energy, which is, somewhat different than the electrification of the vehicle fleet, which is in turn somewhat different from efforts to try and transform the built environment of communities so that transportation doesn't really rely as much on locomotion at all. And so looking at our question list, and also just keeping in mind that I think a lot of our audience kind of has an idea on where they might go, after they're done. The question I'd like to throw out to the three of you, and no particular order this time, whoever wants to jump in, I think, is just where you might see the opportunities for someone coming out of planning school in the next year or two to go into this line of work, and if there's anything that they that you might recommend they do while they're in planning school to prepare them beyond kind of the usual stuff. Broad question, I know, but I suspect it's kind of what's lurking in some of the minds of our listeners.
I guess I'll just say quickly, I was really stressed the whole time I was at Cornell. Um, theme for me, because I feel like there were a lot of like sort of classic planning classes that I didn't take. And then when I first graduated, I was like, oh my God, I don't know how to speak in zoning code. Everybody can. And it's proven to not be relevant to my career whatsoever. If you are really interested in that and going down land use law, like great, that will definitely serve you. But I really think that at least with climate stuff, like it's becoming, there are lots more jobs now in different sectors. But more at my time, I was just like, I'm really passionate about this. And the one thing I know that is true is that I want to work in this field, and I've kind of approached it from different angles, mitigation, adaptation. But yeah, it's kind of been a vague way of getting in, I guess. But I think just like keeping that in mind, because there are a lot of different classes and skills to get, and they can all be applicable.
I would just say in terms of broad field, I mean, I know Tamika mentioned, and I agree, there's more to decarbonization than electric vehicles, but just in terms of kind of the short term, to Sarah's point, you know, the US environment on the topics of deploying electric vehicles, which goes along with it a lot of other things, charging infrastructure, et cetera. There's just like an enormous amount of companies and people and resources and infrastructure planning efforts that all kind of relate to that space. And it, you know, obviously we have some uncertainty in the US landscape, what the next year would look like politically. But there's like a ton of momentum on that. And I think as a broad space, if you're interested in climate and you're coming out of a planning program and you care about transportation there, it does feel like there's a lot happening from private sector to nonprofit advocacy to government positions all across that transportation, electrification space, and not just in cars, but also in trucks, increasingly lots of interesting work there, which is really not on my, even though I was a transportation focused person, I was not interested in freight transport. It's kind of like the forgotten sector for a lot of, I think, planning students anyway, but there's huge amount happening there. So I think that's not a, it's a reasonable broad area of the map to be looking at as a place where there's probably going to be some growth. And then I think to Sarah's point, you know, I also was, I think just grad students are anxious by nature, right? Sort of thinking about your future, you're only there for a couple of years. But you know, things take twists and turns through your careers. I think all three of our paths definitely illustrate. I have really always enjoyed trying to get to the operational core of what's happening. One of the things I liked when I worked at Uber, I worked on the driver team and was sitting in an unglamorous taxi garage in Long Island City in Queens, kind of learning how the thing worked in really meaningful ways. And that was very different than being at the World Bank and like advising someone from, you know, 10,000 miles away what they might do. And whether you want to work in a taxi garage or not, I do think trying to be aware of how businesses work and not being afraid to get your hands dirty kind of at the core of the process, and knowing how the company or organization you're working for actually does the core thing that they're trying to do feels nice. I've also worked sometimes as a consultant, where you're kind of like a little bit far from the implementation reality of things. And I guess from my own bias, I have found you get a lot more knowledge from being close to the doing of the thing that can serve you in all kinds of roles later, whether you're planning or advising somebody else. So it's a good chance to try and get up close and personal with the content you're working on wherever you can. I have found that useful for myself.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Andrew. My suggestion was going to be find things that you can volunteer for and be a part of. You know, I feel really lucky that I had a lot of work experience before I started the PhD program, and I've learned a lot. I don't want to say I haven't learned. I got to take a class with Professor Manville where I finally understood congestion pricing, despite the fact that many clients were paying me handsomely to talk to them about congestion pricing. And so I think, yeah, like take what you can from classes. But I think a lot of my experience is also being able to understand intellectually what congestion pricing is, but then know that I've also worked with organizations, worked with communities that then have to actualize that. And what does that mean for them? And so, you know, I think to the extent there are local organizations, you know, a local bike coalition, a local whatever it may be, where you can become a member, where you can just engage, you can just meet people. That's huge. And then I think the other thing is when you come to things like this, you know, are people speaking on campus and people are giving out their cards, or people are saying, if you have any questions, shoot me an email, follow up with those people. You know, when there are people that you meet or you encounter, who are doing the kind of work you want to do, even if it's not the exact way you want to do it, take that opportunity to network. And then the last thing I'll say is that I think is really important for everybody to do is just be introspective and think about what kind of work makes you happy. I've had a lot of jobs and I've never worked at a government entity because that's just not for me. And I know that, right? Now, I have friends who have worked in government, and I am so happy they're there. And, one of my friends, who was #2 at the Department of Public Health here in LA, said to me once that change working for government is really, really slow. But when you make it, because government is such a bureaucracy, it's really hard to change that back, right? And so something unsexy like changing the procurement processes so that you can pay community nonprofits directly, that is something that will have a huge impact on whatever work you do. And I think it's really important for people to have that kind of introspective process. And I think grad school is a great place to do it, where you are just honest with yourself about who you are, not what other people want you to be or want you to do to be successful, but what kind of things make you happy, and how you can serve kind of that highest purpose you have for what you want to put out in the world.
Wanted to add a very quick plug. I literally wouldn't have known about the Waterfront Alliance if it weren't for Bob Balder, who then became a board member. And then I used the, I'm forgetting the name, but the alumni database to find Rob Pirani's contact info, who then also I had a good conversation with, and he happened to be the boss of my Waterfront Alliance boss, and they talked. So they're really, networking. I know it's so annoying, but the alumni, the Cornell alumni network was really helpful for me. You're paying a lot of money for it, so you should use it.
And for anyone who's not, who's on the call, is not from Cornell, your other alumni networks probably do the same thing. It's I think that's both that point and Tamika's point, both that when you are, one of the things faculty always sort of marvel at is, I mean, we understand people are busy and so forth. It's just when you are at a program and at a university, it's really that there's people come to talk, or there's services available for you, and the typical person who comes to talk, or the typical service that's available, the uptake on it is always incredibly low. And sometimes it's just like people are busy. Like I feel like I don't have time to go find the alumni office and see if they can plug me into something, or it's just you maybe feel a little intimidated for whatever reason to break up a conversation, to Tamika's point, and get the contact info with someone who comes to talk. But in general, if someone comes to talk at a university, it's because they are interested in talking to students. So like it's possible that you give a talk at a university and you actually hate students, but it would be unusual. So most of the time, if you approach someone and just say, I thought what you just said was really interesting, they're going to be like normal humans, quite flattered by that, and will be interested in probably talking to you about it more than you actually want to hear about it. So it's I do think it's great advice to, you don't have to do it every single time someone shows up, but if someone says something that seems quite resonant and really up your alley, like follow up with them, because that is how things get done, in how people make their careers and so forth. So we're coming up on about 20 minutes left. I'm going to just ask the panel if they have any kind of last sort of things that they feel like they want to intel or impart before, and then I would like to open it up, right? I mean, we got about 20 people here, and I'm sure there are questions that have not occurred to me. So I'd like to be able to get to some Q&A. But anything about this that you feel like, I've realized we have not talked about this for very long. It's a short Zoom, but things about just thinking about a career from planning school into transportation decarbonization that you just want to get in very quickly, and then we'll kind of open it up to Q&A. And no pressure if you don't have them, but I just want to give you the opportunity.
I should say one last thing, which I feel like is relevant in the climate space, but a lot of people, and I count myself in this bucket, who are the type of people who go to planning school, obviously come out of a tradition that, for instance, views cars is the source of a lot of our problems, which I think is very justified. And so a lot of times you want solutions to climate change to also be the kinds of solutions you would embrace for anything else. And so I teach a class at urban planning department, and I think there's a lot of skepticism of electric vehicles, which is not totally misplaced because there are a lot of limits to what they can do. But I think sometimes I try and take my urbanist, city-loving, urban planning brain hat off and put my climate hat on, or vice versa, and try and separate, what specifically we're trying to do and what solutions are most appropriate. And I think broadly speaking, on the climate front, we're learning as we go, and we know what the goal is, which is, zero carbon emissions at some reasonable time frame. But the specific ways we get there, we don't know. We've never done it before, right? Hopefully, offshore wind delivers a lot of what we're hoping for. But there's a lot of, as I'm sure Sarah's more aware than any of us, lots of community opposition to even like a wire to bring offshore wind onto the Hamptons. There's lots of problems there, and electric vehicles might be great from a consumer acceptance point of view. They might not be. We don't really know. And I think one of the things I would advocate for is being open to changing your mind about what solutions work best on this particular problem. I don't know if that's career advice or just my pitch on how to approach the problem, but clarity on objectives and flexibility on some of the short-term ways we get there seems to be a good combination for something we've really never done before.
Yeah, I think that's good. Flexibility is always good. I would say that I think intersectionality is a fancy term that a lot of people throw around, but I think it's becoming more and more real every day. We can't talk about transportation without talking about housing. We can't talk about climate without talking about, all of these other things. And so, when we're talking about transportation, we're not just talking about roads. We also have to think about like stormwater capture, right? All of these things overlap. And so I think just building off Andrew's point of staying open, stay open that the answers can change, stay open that the answers have yet to be completely discovered, stay open to the fact that there are some answers out there, and maybe the people who have them aren't the ones we typically listen to. But I do think it's going to be more, how do we think about these overlapping issues that are existentially pressing us as a society, and how do they overlap, and how do they relate, and how do you stay open to that?
Right. Yeah, I think flexibility for sure. We say in offshore wind world, we're building the plane as we fly it. If I hear that expression one more time, I'm probably going to lose my mind. But yeah, I mean, it's a brand new industry, and I really think like following policy at a federal level is exciting right now, also kind of torturous, but there are so many like states, federal government are setting really high procurement targets for getting to, net zero by whatever it is. In New Jersey, for example, we have the governor set the highest procurement target of any other state to procure 11 megawatts of offshore wind energy by 2040. Well, that's great, but there's 7 turbines in the water right now. With this initiative just for New Jersey, we're looking at like hundreds of each plot of land will have about 100 turbines on it. So to meet that, we'll have an ocean full of turbines. That takes a lot of jobs. It takes a lot of planning, and there's a lot of public opinion about it, a lot of NIMBYism, a lot of the same themes that we learn about in planning school, which I'm really up against, and getting those permits for construction, working with local municipalities. So a lot of themes, but I think I guess I'm just sort of a booster for offshore wind specifically, because it's such a fascinating culmination of environmental, social, and planning issues and engineering issues, but also just renewable energy in general. I never really thought that there was a place for me in that sector, but it's physical infrastructure, so it does require planning in a lot of ways.
Great, thank you to all three of you. Okay, so we got about 15 or so minutes left, and I would love to just open it up to our audience if they have any questions. And they may not. This may turn into one of those awkward moments where I ask for questions and nothing happens. But
feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question, or you can just put it in the chat.
My name is Anita, and I am a transportation planner slash, person who's working I'm at the crossroads of figuring out if I want my own practice or start working for a nonprofit. I'm very thankful to the panelists for talking about their involvement with nonprofits. I'm also a volunteer, Tamika, with ITE and APA. I have a mentee right now who is just exploring career options, and she was interested. She comes with the ethnic studies background, and she's interested in working in environmental justice in transportation planning field. What kind of advice should I be giving to somebody like that? I'm not very familiar with industrial decarbonization field. Yeah.
Sure, I can start, but if other people have suggestions, please jump in. But I think you know, whenever folks are looking for jobs, especially now, I keep hearing from my friends who are master students that the job market is tough. So going back to what Andrew said, being open, one thing you've noticed from all of us in our journeys is we've had several jobs. And so, you know, sometimes it's figuring out what job you have at this moment and being open to the fact that there will be another job down the line. I think the other thing to do is when you're really interested in a topic, find people who are doing that work. And whether or not you feel comfortable reaching out to them cold, you know, I spent a lot of time looking at people's bios and figuring out what kind of organizations they work for and where they, you know, where they went in their career path, and then kind of using that to take me down the internet's rabbit hole, not just about Kate Middleton, but you know, to from one job to the next job, and finding out you know, different opportunities. So I always say, you know, wherever it is you want to be, find folks living in that area who are doing the things you already want to do, reach out or kind of figure out what they did in their path or what organizations they're involved in or what kind of activities they go to, and try to duplicate those efforts.
Yeah, that helps a lot. Thank you very, very much.
Any other questions? Don't be shy. Oh, here we go. We got one in the chat. Marissa asks, I think probably to the group, what effective micromobility efforts have you implemented or have you seen implemented?
I can give a little micromobility answer. I feel like my short answer is that the most effective efforts I've seen are the ones that came before we used the term micromobility, not to be too much of a downer, but you know, City Bike in New York and things that have been docked and looked unsexy for a while, I think have proven to be in terms of durability, and Tamika maybe is deeper in space and can give other examples. But I'll tell you that I was at Uber in the era of the kind of real boom in dockless bike share, the early days of Bird, the sort of, I would say, peak of the hype cycle of the early ages of micromobility. And there were a lot of conversations internally where Uber ended up acquiring a bike share company that I really loved. It was run by a friend of mine called Jump Bikes. They do great work and they have beautiful e-bikes. They're now part of sort of technology as part of Line Bike. But there was way more enthusiasm in the kind of VC-backed world to support things that looked like Bird and Lime and dockless bike share because it didn't have government contracts. It sort of had this unlimited, theoretically, ability to scale, and it was going to be magical. And so there was a lot more incentive and interest in buying companies like that and funding companies like that than there was in things like Motivate that ran the docked bike share systems in places like New York. Just sort of fit the VC model of the universe. And at the same time, there was the Chinese dockless bike share companies that had, you know, huge amounts of funding and bikes floating all over the place. Most of that, you know, there was a period where those things were all over the place. So now I know it's still, there are scooter companies, but obviously I think Bird most recently is finally broke potentially. And there are, you know, Lime continues to exist, mostly owned by Uber. But really, I would say I haven't done the numbers on ridership, but I don't think anything competes with City Bike or I'm in Montreal. The docked bike share system here at Big C is pretty successful in terms of riders per capita. So I would say, despite I'll answer your question that you added there too. But in general, I think the ones that have been most successful have been kind of more of dock share or bike share 1.0 than some of the 2.0. Others might disagree, but that's been my experience from kind of witnessing them boom and bust. And on the context broadly on transport decarbonization, Obviously, you know, scooters, if you make a few assumptions about the fact that hopefully the scooter itself doesn't fall apart within a few days and have a lot of embodied emissions with it, it's a very efficient way to get around. You know, it's like a light electric motor, it doesn't take a lot of charge, so it's pretty great. But I think we have to be somewhat realistic, and this is where the course that I teach tries to do this, is sort of be in context of like what's the realistic space for adoption of these kinds of things at the scale of US urban transportation, or just transportation generally. And the sobering facts on the US is that, you know, 2%-ish of all the passenger trips go by public transportation, and a smallish number, although growing, by biking in general. And so the micromobility companies always quote the stat, which is true, that half the trips in the country are under 3 miles. But the truth is that if you converted all the trips under 3 miles to a zero emission mode, the total reduction emissions is like 5, 7, 8%, because a lot of people travel 30 miles to their work. And obviously the energy from a 30-mile trip is 10 times worse than a 3-mile trip. So sometimes we, you know, get statistics that are presented to us in ways that make whoever is telling you them, you know, have the best impact for their company they're working at, which is one of the things that if you work at any particular corporation, you kind of have to believe your piece of the pie is very important. So I would say it's great where it can work, because it's, you know, it's obviously 1,000 times better than a car from an energy perspective. They're all electric, they're great. And we should be finding ways to support them thoughtfully, but maybe not be too disconnected from the reality of what the top end of the adoption might look like at scale in the short term. Maybe in the longer term, we can do a lot of things to kind of make it more possible. Sorry, I went on a long while. You guys may have other thoughts on micro. Tamika, I know you've been in this.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything you said, plus one. I think that piece about the reality that people live in, something I've been saying a lot to folks is, you know, one of the cool things about transportation right now is that we get to plan for the future that we want and that frankly we need, given everything that's happening with climate and the environment. But at the same time, we have to plan in the reality that people live in. And sometimes that's a really hard thing for people to do. When I was working with the city of LA and also the city of San Jose, I think two cities that really have tried to embrace technology and micromobility. I was kind of running these citizen advisory boards as these programs were rolling out. And as Andrew said, people were really excited, but there was also the sense of realism of like, but I don't know if I'm going to use a scooter, right? Like, I don't know if I'm going to use a scooter in downtown LA where there might not be the best infrastructure, but what I do want is my bus to be on time, right? And so I think we hear the same feedback with like electrifying buses, right? That like the average bus rider is like, hey, foundation, you know, saying you want to support electrification of buses, cool, but is that bus going to be on time? And so I think we can do both. I think instead of having these world where we say, you know, electric bus or the bus on time, we have to do both. We have to plan for the future and the now. And then I think as far as adaptation and people kind of taking these things on, I think one of the things we're really struggling with, and not just here, a few summers ago, I led a group of funders on a trip to London to look at congestion pricing, and then the Netherlands to kind of look at their electrification and decarbonization work. And the reality is, like, as successful as they were in the Netherlands, they didn't quite have the infrastructure to keep it going, right? They're like, we don't know how we're going to power all of this. We're running out of land and space. So I also think, how do you prioritize different you know, decarbonization efforts? I think one of the things we can't forget about is maintenance and upkeep and infrastructure that's needed to do some of this work.
I'm happy to jump in on the driverless question that got thrown in by Valerie. Yeah, I feel like I again, the peak of the previous hype cycle around autonomous vehicles was also in that same period of sort of 2017, 2018. And obviously the company I worked at was very invested in that, and then had a real tragedy. One of the first, maybe only deaths caused by an autonomous vehicle. So a really tragic situation that really marked kind of the down point of that earlier phase, that if you look back at some predictions, whether it's from Tesla or Lyft or others in like 2017, they're like, we're going to have fully driverless fleets of cars everywhere by 2020, which didn't happen. But now quietly, obviously, if you're in San Francisco, you can get a ride in a Waymo vehicle and there's nobody in the car besides you. And it sort of feels like the amount of attention that gets now that it's real is less than the attention it got when it wasn't real 7 years ago. It's just in terms of media attention, which I find very strange. So it seems like it's a real thing that is happening in more geographies. And, I'm not a good prognosticator, and I've been through a round of people telling me it was around the corner and then it wasn't. So I'm hesitant to make predictions, but it seems very real. And I think there's lots of evidence of what the consequences will be. If it's really easy to get driven all over the place, then people take more rides and drive more miles, and it just makes the convenience of car rides greater. So, it just seems to indicate that we will be using cars more often, which for all the reasons that planning students know is not a great outcome, whether it's congestion or certainly environmental impacts. So I would say there are potentially lots of benefits, maybe on the safety front if it works, and maybe some accessibility. If you have a disability that keeps you from driving and you're hard to get around a city, you can see some real upside there, but clearly lots of consequences on many things that we care about. So obviously, yes, they should be electric, but that is not like a get out of jail free card for companies that operate them. There's lots of energy implications and congestion implications. So it seems to me like they're much more real than they've ever been, and seemed poised to continue. And we should be thinking actively about how to get the best benefits out of them. But I don't know there's a way to have it not be a world where that becomes a pretty important technology. So we should think about how to manage it.
Yeah, I heard one of the things that Tamika talked about was how to implement this in real times. And I deal with that struggle with the working with engineers, because there's not a whole lot of awareness about the values of sustainability and some of the things that you're talking about, decarbonization. Those conversations are not going on at the local chapters of professional organization. Do you recommend any tools or, like sort of educational offerings that exist to raise awareness about these kind of issues?
Okay, well, we are coming up on time. We got about 4 minutes left. If someone has a very quick question, I'm sure our panelists would be happy to entertain it. But if there are none, I'm sure we'd also be happy to move slightly closer to Friday.
How do you bring together engineers and planners to talk about decarbonization? I mean, that's one of the questions I've struggled with constantly and continue to struggle with being a member of professional organization. And that's why I was asking, what kind of tools do you recommend? Yeah.
I've spent my whole career being the one planner in a group of engineers, so I don't know. Do you mean tool like software? Because I don't think that exists. Maybe Zoom.
What kind of persuasive methods, or like how do you bring awareness to a group that is so technically focused that it is really hard to bring sustainability topics that you're talking about? It's easier to talk to planners, in my perspective, versus with engineers who are focused on standards and manuals and that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we have 2 minutes. So very quickly, I just think that we need each other. We are complementary skill sets. And I find often, communication styles, engineers work on projects that need to be explained or sold or used, and planners can be good communicators and doing that. Also thinking like at a higher level, I think being in the weeds versus thinking at scale as planners do is like a very helpful thing. So yeah, I feel like those are my two points.
I would just add, find people who are already doing it and see what they do. So again, Tool Design is a great firm that has, these multiple perspectives. The other person who I think has been getting a lot of press lately is Veronica Davis, who used to run infrastructure for the city of Houston. They have a new mayor, so she's on the job market now, but she is trained as an engineer and has been effective in talking to engineers, but kind of understanding the broader things that planners understand. I think Ryan Russo, who started the Oakland Department of Transportation, is another person who did some pretty innovative things with the engineers and his department. So just finding folks who have done it and kind of looking to their wisdom.
Thanks, everyone. I appreciate it.
All right, I think we are at time. And so, you know, by the power vested in me by this ACSP working group, I thank the panelists so much for their insight. I thought it was super helpful. Thank Katie for organizing. And yeah, unless Katie, I'm missing anything, are we dismissed?
We're dismissed. A recording of this will be emailed out to you all and also posted on the ACSP website, as well as a post-event survey. So if you do not mind filling that out, we would greatly appreciate it. We really appreciate our panelists and all of their time spent with us today, and hope to see some more of you at our next panel next month, which is on climate planning and local government. And that information is also on the ACSP website. But thank you so much, everybody. Have a good day.
Take care all. Bye.